Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and you're listening to Diplomatic Immunity from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Welcome to the third episode of our fall series, where today I'm delighted to talk with Carolina Jiménez Sandoval, president of the Washington Office on Latin America, about Venezuelan politics and history, especially in light of current U.S.-Venezuela tensions.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Carolina Jiménez Sandoval holds over 20 years of experience in research and advocacy for human rights in the Americas and throughout the world. Prior to her current role, she served as Deputy Research Director for the Americas with Amnesty International in Mexico City. From 2008 to 2010, she was Country Director of the Jesuit Refugee Service on the Colombian-Venezuelan border. Let's listen in to the conversation. All right, folks, welcome back to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity. And as I noted, I'm excited today to talk to Carolina Jiménez Sandoval about Venezuela, a little bit of, what is the history of Venezuela, the political situation, and what exactly the U.S. is doing down there. So, Carolina, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so let's start broadly. I'm sure, the majority of our listeners understand what kind of that we're doing something in Venezuela right now, and that the U.S. hasn't had the greatest relations with Venezuela over the past few decades. But let's get a little bit of historical background to that. So how would you characterize politics in Venezuela over the last 2 to 3 decades?
I would say the last 25 years or so have been marked by a lot of political changes in Venezuela. And many of them are related to what, is known as the Bolivarian Revolution, which, it's a political project led by Hugo Chavez. Chavez was a lieutenant colonel who attempted a coup d'etat in 1992 at a time when Venezuela was seen as a very solid and robust democracy. I think at that point, when there was a coup attempt, everybody was surprised. And Hugo Chavez went to prison because of that coup attempt, and then he was released through a presidential pardon and became a popular figure. And to the extent that he was democratically elected in 1998, took office in 1999, and he promised to bring social and economic changes to the country. And he did so by launching a revolution. But people were hopeful, and I do have to say that at the beginning of his political project, Chavez promoted, political participation. Chavez promoted popular mobilization, and he was popular, a very charismatic, and popular leader. Unfortunately, he had a lot of opposition from different political and economic elites, and Chavez started taking an authoritarian turn. He started limiting freedom of speech. He started having a very conflictive and divisive relationship with the political opposition, and what started as a popular and revolutionary process drifted towards, a less democratic political process, and that's how we reached 2013, a year in which the unthinkable happened, meaning the revolutionary leader passed away. And before he died, Chavez asked Venezuelans to vote for his political heir, Nicolas Maduro. So new elections were called, and Maduro was elected president, but with a very small margin. And then things went downhill from then onwards because Maduro did not have Chavez political capital. On the contrary, he wasn't a charismatic leader. He wasn't a military man, and the economy was already showing very serious signs of decline. So I think Maduro consolidated the authoritarian project that we were witnessing before, and what we see today is a very, solid authoritarianism and under a very repressive regime.
So before we talk about the U.S. And its role in this, you mentioned Maduro coming to power after Chavez passed away. And, we've read stories, and I'm sure people are familiar with the economic situation in Venezuela. So talk a little bit about, like, what is it actually like in Venezuela economically? How bad is it? And, what are the broad strokes of what caused that? Was it just the oil prices plummeting, or how did that happen?
If you have to, define life in Venezuela, you can say life is hard and life is uncertain. It is important for any family to know what you're going to eat the day after, if your children are going to go to school, if you're sick, if you're going to have the medicines. None of that is available to a Venezuelan family. 1 out of 3 Venezuelans are food insecure. And many children do not go to school or do not go to school every day, and the health system have collapsed. So to answer the question about the Venezuelan economy, there is one key thing you need to know about Venezuela, and it is that it's an oil exporting country. 90% of Venezuelan exports depend on oil. So when oil prices are up, Venezuela does better. When oil prices go down, the economy suffers. Now, it doesn't only depend on prices, it also depends on production. And the production of oil, when Chavez got to power, was pretty high. It was around 3 million barrels per day. Chavez made the oil industry, it's a Venezuelan oil industry, produce many other things. I mean, we had a very efficient oil company become a company that started producing chickens and started people started being trained to participate in military exercises, etc. I mean, he truly took the oil company to be many other things, and there was a lot of cases of corruption, etc. So it stopped producing 3 million barrels a day, and this impacted, the economy. So when Maduro came to power, oil prices went down. That is absolutely true. So of course, yes, the economy was going to suffer, but the level of production was also very, very low, and the corruption and the mismanagement are also a reason why the country couldn't recover once the oil prices became more stable. So what you had in Venezuela from 2014 to at least 2020 was, shortages. And I'm sure you probably saw some of those pictures of people, lining, queuing for hours to buy food. People fleeing the country because they couldn't buy antibiotics, and they depended on antibiotics for medicine. Women who were pregnant crossing the border to have children in other countries so they could have the healthcare they needed. And that's why it is precisely in 2014 when the forced migration crisis started. So by 2017, 2.3 million Venezuelans had already fled the country. And at that point, Venezuela was around 24 million or so. And then, yes, the first Trump administration imposed economic sanctions on the country. So that made an existing humanitarian crisis worse. I mean, sanctions didn't start the humanitarian crisis, but sanctions made the crisis worse. So increased forced migration and increased economic hardships. And I think, unfortunately, the humanitarian crisis continues to this day.
So, things have gotten worse, and we know that there's been challengers to Maduro. So how has he been able to maintain his hold on power for so long? What is this, is it this corrupt patronage system? Is it the use of force? Is it both? What is it?
I think it's a combination of different factors. There is no doubt that the armed forces play a big role in keeping Maduro in power. I often joke and say Maduro is one of the few civilians in the government. When you think about his cabinet, and you think that in Venezuela, the Secretary of Justice and Peace is a military. I mean, think about what that means. In the last few years, he changes, right? His cabinet members quite often. But when you look at the members of his cabinet, the Secretary of Housing, the Secretary of Food, we see so many military men, because usually they are men, go, be member of the cabinet, that you end up looking at Maduro like one of the few civilians in charge of the country. So his relationship with the military is a relationship of dependency, really. I mean, he depends on the armed forces to keep him in power. And that what ends up happening is that he gives the military a lot of power. They have a very strong, decision-making power. And he gives them resources. So the military are basically in charge of the oil company these days, but they are also in charge of, the extraction of different types of minerals and other economies, including illicit economies. I think the military now play a role that is even more important than the role they played when Chavez, who was a military, when he was in power. The second factor is no doubt repression and surveillance. In Venezuela, the number of political prisoners is one of the highest in the entire region. It's over 1,000 people are arbitrarily detained due to political reasons. There are, unfortunately, the number of extrajudicial executions in the last 10 years or so, it's over 15,000 people, mainly in security operations. And it is incredibly difficult to deal with the censorship, and people don't have an idea of what it is. You can go to prison because of a tweet or a post on X. You can go to prison because you print something, in this, and you put it. Someone sees what you printed and accuses you to the police. There are recently the case of a young woman who prints things on T-shirts, and this is her business. She makes T-shirts for a living. So somebody took a picture of a young man hitting the statue of Hugo Chavez. This happened during the protests. Many people took to the streets. They went and tried to destroy the statues of Hugo Chavez around the country. Somebody took pictures. Many journalists took pictures. One guy took that picture and he wanted a T-shirt made. Now, that's her business, of course. She printed the picture in the T-shirt. Now she is in prison for doing something that, she was paid to do, which was, part of her, to make a living. So we have people, who have been in prison for tweeting, people who are in prison for teaching, people who are in prison for writing, for doing the work of journalists. There are at least 5 human rights defenders in prison. So I think the repression is real and is suffocating. Venezuela is the only country in the Americas with an open investigation before the International Criminal Court. So it's really, really, really bad. And I would say a third factor, which is important, is the support of some international allies that provide political capital, but also resources. Despite, many years under heavy sanctions, Venezuela is still very close to Russia, to Iran, to China, and these countries have served as a lifeline during difficult moments. And they still stand with Venezuela in important diplomatic forums, but they have also served as a source of income when things have been very difficult. And I think we cannot underestimate what the war has meant for the regime.
Yeah. Do you think that's gone down some since Russia invaded Ukraine and is under its own sanctions, or has, you think China's stepped up instead, or how do you think that's going to be something that can continue?
I think the economic support of the Russians maybe, but not the political support. And the Chinese are incredibly pragmatic. Venezuela owes a lot of money to China. So China hasn't been lending money as it used to, because Venezuela has been unable to repay And as, maybe they ideologically are closer to Maduro than to other countries in the region, but they are pragmatic when it comes to, uh, their financial relationship. So those relationships have changed, but they are still, supportive of Maduro. Despite the fraud in 2024, they all came out and openly congratulated Maduro on its illegal re-election. So the support at the international level is still there.
Okay. So, moving to the U.S. relationship, and we'll get into the current moment in my next question, but let's, again, if you could provide our listeners a little bit of background, just sort of, what has been the historic relationship between the U.S. and Venezuela, going back again 25, 30, 40 years. I mean, we all, I think, are aware of sort of the view of the United States from Latin America, because of its heavy-handedness over centuries. Was that something that was apparent in Venezuela? And, how were relations in the earlier period before Chavez, then with Chavez?
Because Venezuela is an oil exporting country and it has been since, the beginning of the 20th century, I think it had a much closer relationship with the US than other Latin American countries. It also was a democracy, in the 1960s and 70s when other Latin American countries were dictatorships. So the relationship with the US was a close one. And while other countries in Latin America were, I don't know, playing soccer, for example, or football, as we say in South America, in Venezuela, the national sport was and still is baseball. We were, people used to come to the US, to travel to the US for holidays. There were many Americans working in the oil fields in the second half of the 20th century, because there were many American companies investing in working in Venezuela, which is why actually the baseball tradition started around the oil fields with American engineers living in Venezuela. There has always been a strong connection between the people of the United States and the people of Venezuela. When Chavez came to power, that changed a lot, because Chavez was an anti-imperialist leader. And he became an international voice against the U.S., especially around the invasion of Iraq. So George W. Bush was president, and Chavez, came to the UN and gave his famous speech saying, "Oh, it smells like sulfur here," after Bush was at the UN. And that made him internationally popular among many people and many other leaders who opposed the work on Iraq. So that very strong antagonistic feeling in the U.S., I think, is very much a post-Chavez, feeling. I think still, I would say the feeling is a nuanced one. I mean, many people don't feel the U.S. is an enemy, but it doesn't always feel it's an ally either. Now you have other elements that define the relationship. Migration is one of them. It wasn't a few years ago. A few years ago, you had, I don't know, 100,000 Venezuelans living in the U.S. Now you almost have 1 million. That's a major change in a matter of less than a decade. So the relationship has changed. And I do have to say that at the moment it's a very complex one, politically and also socially, for when it comes to how people feel about the U.S.
So, diving deeper into the current moment, and we know for the past month or so, the U.S. has been conducting military strikes on supposed drug boats coming to the United States. And as we were recording this on Friday, October 24th, we just got a report in that the Pentagon just announced that the U.S. is moving a aircraft carrier strike group from the Middle East to the Caribbean. So getting more military assets into the region, obviously that's a pretty big move. So can you talk to us a little bit about what, what you're seeing with these strikes? How big of an issue is the drug trade in Venezuela? I mean, we know that, the mass amount of drugs is actually coming to the United States through the Pacific, not the Atlantic and the Caribbean. So, how much of this is a means to eventually potentially, get Maduro out of power? How is this being viewed there?
It's not only that most of the cocaine comes from the Pacific, it's also that the main drug killing Americans is fentanyl. And fentanyl comes from Mexico. I mean, fentanyl does not come from Colombia and from Venezuela. So if the United States is really serious about attacking the main drug causing deaths in the United States, it should focus on preventing overdoses caused by fentanyl. And I think we will all agree that is a very relevant undertaking, because fentanyl overdoses have been decreasing, and they have been decreasing because it is understood that drugs are a public health issue, and when you provide the right care, the number of overdoses decrease. Now, if that is the case, as the data shows, the big question is, so what are those military strikes all about? And yes, many of us are starting to feel that clearly the whole idea of this being a drug enforcement strategy doesn't add up. So what is it then? On the one hand, there is a clear show of force. America is back to Latin America. But not as a partner, but as a hegemon, right? This is American area of influence, and in the U.S. is showing that, which is very 19th century policy. I mean, it's very worrisome to see that we're going back to previous practices that undermine U.S. credibility in the region, because it's very hard to see the U.S. as a partner or as an ally when it does things like this. So that's a problem for the U.S., I believe. And then the second, of course, immediate conclusion is that the U.S. is trying to topple Maduro. If that is the case, the question is, to what end? I mean, what does the U.S. get by doing so? At the moment, there are almost weekly, deportation flights. So Maduro is already receiving deportees. You don't need to put any pressure on Maduro to, get deportees. Chevron, which is the main, U.S. company operating in Venezuela, obtained a license. It is a license with restrictions, but the U.S. is buying oil from Venezuela. What we feel is that there isn't a clear objective when it comes to U.S. policy towards Venezuela. We see that at the beginning of this administration, there was a lot of ambiguity. On the one hand, you had Ambassador Rick Granell, trying to negotiate Maduro, and then you had the Secretary of State Rubio, playing the maximum pressure card. I think it's clear that now Secretary of State Rubio is the one in charge of policy, but we don't see a well-designed strategy. You put, a major military buildup in the Caribbean, you start, military strikes that are illegal under international and domestic law, you show force, you present a credible threat to the Maduro regime. This threat clearly, day by day, becomes more real, I guess, in a way to try to break the circle around Maduro, especially to create the feeling in the armed forces that it is better to leave Maduro, right, than to support him but it hasn't happened so far. And it's been almost, 2 months since the strike started. So will this increase, right? Will we see military strikes inside Venezuela? It's still an open question. Some are saying that that is the next step. The president has sort of hinted to that, President Trump. But I think that my main concern is the lack of a clear strategy with well-defined objectives. And I think it will be a mistake, to go inside a country that is very complex, where there are very different violent groups operating, just to topple a regime that is very repressive against its people. The Venezuelan people want gone, but want it peacefully.
Yeah, and as history shows, and as Americans know well, regime change can oftentimes lead to worse outcomes. And looking into that a little bit more specifically, the opposition movement is, as you said, obviously one of the ways he maintains control is repression and surveillance and things like that. So it's difficult for an opposition movement. But we just saw Maria Corina Machado win the Nobel Peace Prize a couple weeks ago. So, tell us a little bit about her. What does she represent? And what's the status to the opposition movement in Venezuela?
Well, if you are Venezuelan, Maria Corina has been a sort of a part of your life for at least 2 decades, right? I mean, for the world, she may be a new name because she won the Nobel Peace Prize, but she's been part of our political life for many years. She was a member of parliament, and she was elected in 2010, I believe. And one of the things that made her most known is because she was confrontational against Chavez at a time when he was very popular. And when he was very popular, people were often, him being this charismatic military man that could speak to the masses, basically. And she wasn't afraid of confronting him, especially in Congress. And that made her a voice, a major voice in the opposition, her willingness to confront him openly, to challenge him publicly. She was, her period was cut short precisely because there were many ways, to limit the work of the opposition, and has been many ways to work to limit the opposition during all these years. But she continued doing politics. I mean, nothing has stopped Machado during this year, and that's one thing that I think defines Maria Corina: consistency. When you look at many of the political leaders of the opposition, you see that many are in exile because they were forced to flee the country, and unfortunately, many are behind bars. If there is one thing that you can say about Maria Corina Machado, is that she chose to be in the country despite the personal sacrifices it meant. She is the mother of two sons and one daughter. The 3 of them live outside of Venezuela. She is in Venezuela without her children because she decided to stay and do politics. And I do think that what she did in 2023, when she decided to run for president, she won the primary elections to be the candidate. And of course, the regime did not let her be the candidate, and she was barred from running, was remarkable. She decided to support another candidate who was allowed to run, who was elected at the end. And she did the campaign. She traveled around the country, but she organized a movement and she led a movement. And it was remarkable to see a country united behind her, despite the repression, despite the lack of guarantees to vote. People did it, and did it peacefully. And that's what I think. Venezuelans have a democratic culture, and Venezuelans want a peaceful change. And so I think Maria Corina Machado embodies that spirit. Of course, she isn't without controversy. I think because she, like many other opposition members, feel that they have tried everything to change things in Venezuela. And after so many years, here we are. I mean, in 2027, in 2026, the Bolivarian Revolution will be 27 years. That, if you're a young Venezuelan, you don't know any other party in government. You don't know anything else. You have never seen anybody else but Chavez and his hair. And it's a strong thing to say, but our children don't think about the future and think about change, because they don't, I mean, uh, people lose hope when they don't see change. I mean, political change is important not only because it maintains democracy, it's because it also important for societies to evolve. Uh, that's why migration happens, because people feel that inside the country there is no hope. So when that hope is lost, political actors seek help in other places. And I think what Machado and other political leaders are doing is placing a lot of their hope on the action of the Trump administration. Right? They're tired, basically, of so many agreements that have been in negotiations that have happened before and that haven't, resulted in a peaceful transition. So now they're willing to support Trump's actions. And yeah, this is something that have been very divisive within the opposition camp and within Venezuelan society itself.
So you mentioned, and we've talked about the fact that the U.S. is positioning more military assets in the region. And, when you're looking at the Maduro regime and America's relations with Venezuela right now, knowing that you're speaking to a U.S. audience, I'll get you out of here on an easy last question. We'd obviously like to see something that's political and diplomatic, not military. So, what are sort of some of the policy steps the U.S. could take that you'd like to see and are watching for in the next, 6 to 9 months?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is a hard question indeed. Oh, no, he doesn't want to leave, and those around him do not want to leave either, right? Because it's not just Maduro. And I think this is important also to think about. It's Maduro and in a circle of people surrounding Maduro. I think there are many things that we still need to continue trying. The the flow of money. I mean, we haven't really tried more multilateral sanctions, right? I mean, when you think about the apartheid in South Africa, for example, it was a time when the international community was able to join forces and agree on one overall strategy. I mean, all the sanctions against South Africa were coordinated. And I think it's much harder these days to coordinate the strategy. So you have the maximum pressure of the US on one side, and now you have this very aggressive, military threat on the US on one side, Europe sort of silent on the other side, a region, I mean, meaning Latin America, very divided on Venezuela. It's very hard to coordinate the strategies. And I think a country like this, in a repressive regime like this, needs to face a coordinated international community. And that we don't see that. And it would be great to see even this administration taking the leadership in that, as it does in other cases. And we're seeing, that the administration has been able to coordinate other political actors to reach agreements in other political crises in the world. I think the Venezuelan case deserves a strategy like that, a more coordinated approach. I also think it will be important for the administration to understand that opposing Maduro is not enough. we need support for the Venezuelan people. This, of course, is very difficult at a time when the administration is, I have to say that this way, but very obsessed about migration. But the truth is that if you change the push factors, you won't have to deal with the pull factors. So if there is a peaceful change and Venezuelans feel they want to go back and they can go back, it will happen because forced migration has that adjective for a reason. It's forced. A lot of the Venezuelans I interview whenever I go to countries, with a large number of Venezuelans, they, many of them did not want to leave. Now, if there is, if there is more instability in Venezuela, I don't see how the forced migration crisis will end. On the contrary, it could become worse. I think those are things the U.S. administration need to think well. But I think opposing Maduro is not enough. Supporting the Venezuelan people is a better strategy.
All right, Carolina, thank you so much for enlightening us today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks again to Carolina for her time and thoughts, and thank you for listening to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Abdullah Nassif. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GUDiplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.